Dear colleagues, friends and guests, welcome to our research seminar. The National Bank of Ukraine has a two-year tradition of holding regular research seminars. I guess our colleagues from monetary policy have taken the lead, and but financial stability, we don't want to be lagging behind. So today's seminar is devoted to topics related to macroprudential policies. We have a guest from National Bank of Poland, Piotr Bańbuła. He's a head of Macroprudential Policy Division. We are always happy to have people from the National Bank of Poland here at NBU. We have a very long tradition of cooperation, and we have just excellent relationship, and we have excellent exchange of expertise and experience. So it's a great pleasure to be listening to a wonderful presentation that I've already seen, and I expect a fruitful discussion after this presentation. So, Piotr, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, thank you for a kind invitation. It's an honor to be here and to exchange our initial experience on macroprudential policy. Standard disclaimer applies, so I'm speaking in my own capacity. Not everything that I say is necessarily an opinion of National Bank of Poland, even though we may share opinions. So what thoughts I would like to share with you today? I would like to share some fundamental, perhaps to some extent philosophical thoughts of what macroprudential policy can and should achieve, and what it cannot and should not try to achieve. So what are the expectations we can have towards it? I will share some brief or not that brief remarks on calibration of macroprudential tools in Poland in three selected areas, how we try to approach it from analytical perspective, from decision-making process. I will, and last but not least, I will spend some time on discussing cohabitation of macroprudential and monetary policy, which is important for all banks where the decisions are taken on the same roof, and even perhaps more important at NBU where there is macroprudential policy as well. So starting with tenets of macroprudential policy. Well, I think what is crucial to acknowledge that we have experienced crisis, we just experienced crisis, and we will experience crisis. So we should not expect that thanks to better macroprudential policy, sounder macroprudential policy, and other policies, we will avoid crisis altogether. Crises have been there regardless of political system, economic system, geographic location. And this is part and parcel of economic activity. So this is important to acknowledge it and to realize what types of crisis we may try to avoid and what type of crisis we should avoid not. This will be a challenging task because then we would need to explain to the public, to other decision makers, what has actually happened and why we have failed to prevent the crisis. Well, we will see how we cope with it, but let me point out to the difficulty of avoiding or trying to avoid systemic risk. So a systemic risk can be defined in various ways. In a nutshell, we can think that this is an event when there is financial tension affecting many agents in the economy, households, corporates, and financial institutions that end up in bankruptcy or near bankruptcy, that contribute to deep economic slowdown, recession, and we know historically that recessions that are combined with financial crisis are deeper, last longer, and the recovery is more anemic. So they are very costly. And this is the type of crisis we would like to avoid, like the last one. But can it be avoided and should be avoided? In terms, when we would think of systemic risk, I think we should disentangle or try to disentangle some parts of it. So one part of systemic risk may come from innovation. There is a quote from Albert Einstein. So if it goes like, I don't know whether it's legible from the end of the room, so I'll read it. If we knew what it was, what we are doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it? Now, by the definition of innovation, of scientific progress, or of innovation itself, we are finding something new that was not known before. But by the definition of science, we do not yet understand all the implications of what we have seen. We can think of pesticides used in early 50s. We only realized with the benefit of many years of research that they had detrimental effects on human livers. But it was only the benefit of hindsight. Collateralized debt obligations, pricing of them before the financial crisis. There was a clear innovation, but we have not understood all the implications of it. I think it's best captured in the article by Daron Acemoglu, Lessons from and for Economics After the Financial Crisis. He published it in 2008 or in 2009. I read it twice. On the first occasion, I thought it's okay, but I knew it was Daron Acemoglu, so I read it once again, and then I think I understood the implications and the deep importance of what he was highlighting better. So part of economic activity is systemic risk, because if we do not take any risk, there would be no development. Sometimes the risk we take is just related to a single institution. But sometimes it is related to a structural change in the economy, which is risky. We do not know all the outcomes. This is part of life. So, and sometimes it will end up in crisis because we have taken the wrong path. So this is part of the reality that we should acknowledge, that we don't know everything, and sometimes this lack of knowledge the scientific lack of knowledge is going to end up in unfortunate situation. Second aspect is our cognitive limitation. And this is a quote from my almost favorite John von Neumann in terms of his cognitive limitations that are not very limited as a human being. So he said, being one of the most prominent mathematicians of the 20th century and the most brilliant minds of the 20th century in terms of cognitive skills, if people do not believe that mathematics is simple, it's only because they do not realize how complicated life is. So let me provide you an analogy. I don't personally like analogies very much because they at one side highlight but obscure, because we cannot say that particles are like balls. It will obscure some parts, but we can highlight something. So let's think about weather forecasts. In climate analysis, we understand very well the basic relationship governing behavior of particles. Wind, how temperature affects the differences in pressure affect movements of air, how topography affects the climate. However, even though we know what are the basic rules, the system is so complex that it's difficult to forecast what will happen few days from now, not to mention few weeks. Now, what we have in economics? the basic particles are humans. And the two aspects that are crucial in their behavior is their knowledge, so we call it expectations in economics. And second aspect is how they, what are their preferences towards risk, how they behave in risky situations. So this is related to utility functions, however we model it. But these two aspects, modeling of expectations and of behavior under risk, or better yet, under uncertainty or ambiguity, is not well understood in economics. So we don't really have yet a very good understanding of basic relationship governing the system. And we should not assume, and we should take it as our limitation that we do not understand everything fully. And this is limitation for decision makers, that once we decide to change the working of the system by imposing some rules, we should not assume that we will understand everything, or we should not assume that we understand the risk definitely better than the participants. We should be humble in this respect, and we should realize that we will inevitably make errors in our judgment. So, and this is an important caveat, how active we should be, or how restrained. We should be bold, but at the same time restrained. And it boils down to good analysis underlying our decision making. Yet, understanding the analysis will likely turn out to be inaccurate or erroneous with benefit of hindsight, inevitably. Now, where we have a clear mandate to act, even if you're a hardline economic liberal, is with negative externalities. Negative externality is a situation when the two counterparties of the contract do not internalize in the price all the effects of the transaction. There are positive externalities, and we suppose that education is one. So there are side benefits to the whole society of people being more educated. But there are negative externalities with air pollution. When we could be buying electricity from a dirty plant at a way lower price, we know that the pollution affects us, but we do not account for the pollution affecting all others apart from closest to us. And so we would be inclined to buy cheaply. And taxing dirty energy is a way of accounting for this negative side effect that is not accounted for in the transaction. And there is clear mandate to do so, even in hardline liberal economic thinking. Now, there have been, following the crisis, there have been many negative externalities identified in the financial system. One is too big to fail or too important to fail institution that may benefit from the fact that everyone knows that the collapse of the institution will lead to a systemic crisis, and therefore the institutions will not be allowed to collapse. What are the consequences? It can found itself at a too low interest rate, having higher profits than other companies. These profits will be distributed to employees, shareholders. And why it can fund itself at lower interest rate? Because the creditors know that in the worst case scenario, the state will come and simply aid the company. So it creates a perverted incentives for everyone to take on too much risk, because it's like a capitalism of gains and socialism of losses. So when there are gains, company and employees take on gains, and when there are losses, the taxpayer comes. And there is a clear mandate to cut too big to fail, or to try to work this problem out. However, politically speaking, it's very difficult, because these are also national champions, and as we see following the crisis, there was a limited move to really diminish them in size. We have many other negative aspects which important depends on the development of the market. Strategic complementarity, where institutions observe that the benefits from them when they act in the same direction moving together, the payoffs from such strategy are higher than from acting differently. And it leads to cyclical behavior, to lax credit standards, and too stiff following the crisis. Because if everyone is losing credit standards at some point, and will be screening hardly, will be granting less loans, losing market value, and in boom phase, the risk is relatively low, because the probability of problems with debt servicing is low. So there is tendency to relax credit standards. Also, there is this aspect that if I do what everyone else does, in the end, I could simply say, you know, this was everyone's problem. It's not only me. And this is where macroprudential policy can act to put some straitjacket on the whole system. But there is a question of how well we understand these aspects. Fire sales. If we look at from micro perspective, we may see that every institution is relatively resilient. But when we would realize that every institution holds the very same asset as a collateral and liquidity buffer, and they would need to sell it in order to cover for some losses, and everyone would be selling at the very same time, that would put a pressure on the price of the asset, have a negative spiral when asset will fall in price, therefore the amount of funding one can get from it is lowered, and we have a vicious cycle. That was described by Brunner, Murray, and Pedersen in 2009 in fire sales and funding spirals. And perhaps not that important in economics like economics in Poland, in Ukraine, interconnectedness of the financial system between institutions. However, we are working towards understanding better the interconnectedness between various sectors of the economy, households, banks, and business. And this is perhaps the nexus between business, corporates, and banks is important. The weaker the institutions, the more important it is. Now, so what are the expectations we can have towards macroprudential policy? We have observed that there have been crises in history, and these crises are very costly. Perhaps some of them we can try to avoid by limiting these negative incentives that are in the financial system. So we would be trying to avoid yes, I know that it doesn't work with LCD. So we would like to avoid these downturns of economic activity. So what is the expected outcome we hope for? Well, at best case scenario, this is the upper line. When we would eliminate the negative externality, it would mean that the resources in the financial system are more effectively invested in better projects that will not only result in decreased probability of crisis, but perhaps higher growth. So this is like, as English say, killing two birds with one stone, which is a bit brutal, but yes, this is what we could achieve. And this is why there is such a strong mandate to do macroprudential policy based on elimination of negative externalities. What perhaps we can more humbly hope for is that we will at least eliminate partly the risk of financial crisis, and will end up with a dashed line, which is still in terms of GDP substantially higher than the one which entails financial crisis. But there is an important but. What if we try to be overly aggressive? We try to take over decision-making in the financial sector. Instead of setting the incentives right, we take on decision-making in banking business. We say, you know, the loans you should be granting should not have LTV higher than, debt service to income higher than, and these borrowers should get loans, these not. And then once we put many, many rules, the banks will decide, well, let's stick to the rules. There are so many of them that we have little room for maneuver. And if something goes wrong, we'll only say that this was the supervisor who was saying to us what to do. So the best solution is to set incentives for the bank to do right things, and for them to acknowledge that if they fail to do things properly, they will be held accountable. The managers, accountable that they will lose job, and they will have problems with finding new one, rather than knowing that they can easily escape any responsibility. Now, if we try to be overly aggressive, because we do not understand everything due to cognitive limitations, how the system works, we know what centrally planned economics look like, and they are not most effective. And there is this tension that once, even at European level, some people believe that we should be relatively bold and aggressive in a number of, how many tools we'll be using, how micro we should be. So imposing LTV limits that will be heterogeneous across regions, different in this city and this in this zone, and debt service to income. And there is a question, so how active we should be. There is a risk that if we do not understand things properly, and we are very active, we really can kill part of innovation. And if we kill part of the innovation, we may end up having indeed less crisis, but lower pace of growth. And in the end, it may end up that it's not a better solution. There is a good paper in Journal of Economic, Quarterly Journal Economics in late 2009, when authors have shown that you can have liberal rules or strict rules. And under liberal rules, you end up having more crisis, but actually the level of GDP per capita turns out to be higher. So there is a question that there is a trade-off between stability and growth. And it's not easy to balance. So, if I were to summarize it, to use a medical metaphor, primum non nocere. So, first, do not harm. So we should not try to take over decision-making from the financial sector. We should set the right incentives rather than saying what they should do. We should make them accountable for what they do, take both the spoils and the downside of the decision-making. So it's clear-cut when we target negative externalities. However, to be honest, it's easy to say from this point that we should target negative externalities, but when it boils down to actual practical decision-making, it's not that easy which tools should be perfectly suited for targeting this particular externality, how to devise them. But working towards thinking in this direction is a good way forward. I was recently at the conference where various high-level decision-makers from many central banks were sharing their view on the macroprudential policy. And the common theme, if I may summarize this way, that all of them focused on benefits but neither focused on costs. And that was pointed out by David Romer, who was participating there. He was, I wouldn't say perhaps appalled, but really moved by the fact that many decision makers were so eager to act boldly without fully understanding the consequences of their action, consequences related to cost. And I will spend some time on it when I will be discussing calibration of some of the tools. So when I see how the process has evolved in Poland, and it is perhaps natural because it's easier, and particularly in central bank, that we focus on cyclical component of systemic risk. So there is development in financial cycle when there is increased credit growth, relaxed credit standards, and this is the type of analysis, the cyclical analysis, how the system evolves, that central banks are used to due to analysis for monetary policy. And there is a risk of being quite active because there are many tools that we could use in this area. It is much more difficult to set a good structural tools that would really set any incentives right. So there are two ways of doing macroprudential policy. Active macroprudential policy, trying to fine-tune things, and passive macroprudential policy by setting regulations right. I believe that passive macroprudential policy is crucial. It's perhaps more what the US tries to do for good or bad, and how well they fare is a different question, but to set incentives right. To have a framework when financial institutions operate, leave decision-making to them, but have boundaries. And the problem is that the more elaborate the boundaries are, the more easily game they are. So it's like with constitutions. When the constitution is relatively general, it stays. When it's very detailed, it does not work for long periods. So here we also have to set the balance right. Now, as the list of instruments goes, well, and this is, we have not yet discussed it, but our internal discussions point that, and I truly believe it, and I hope that I can to some extent argue why, that the list of instruments that we should be using should be as short as possible. So instead of, there are many tools at our disposal: capital buffers, debt service to income ratios, LTVs, lending standards. Well, the real life shows that many are used at the same time, and perhaps they should be, but we should be as limited as possible. First, the communication is much easier when we have a limited number of tools. So we can communicate our goals transparently, and importantly, we can evaluate the effects of the decisions more easily. Because once we have many tools used at the same time, it's very difficult to disentangle the effects of individual ones. And we will perhaps not know which one was effective and which one was not. And the more tools there are, the more strict the regulatory jacket becomes, and perhaps too strict. So I believe the list should be short. What we have in Poland, where we have part of some instruments imposed by EU regulations, either directly, which is through regulations, or through directives that are translated into national law. And this mostly relates to Pillar 1 requirements, when we have a floor for micro rules, so to say, and capital buffers, which is macroprudential side. Then we add, on top of it, we add tools that are used widely on global scale. So these are LTV, the most popular tool, which has obviously macroprudential flavor, debt service to income or debt to income. The two are can be thought as substitutes, because there is a clear mathematical relationship between the two, with debt service to income putting a floor on current debt service, but when it's in variable interest rates, it can be perceived as relatively safe and low during low interest rate environment, but when interest rates are increased, such limit will fail to account for potentially higher debt burden, and debt to income limit is, accounts for it. I like the approach taken by some central banks when they allow, like Bank of England or Bank of Ireland, when they allow part of the portfolio not to fulfill, not to comply with regulation, like 10-15%. Why? When they say, well, if the credit risk is multidimensional problem, we may perhaps fail to fully catch it with one variable. Therefore, think of first-time buyers. A young graduate from good university having a good job, it is very unlikely that he or she would have problems with servicing the debt, even though the initial salary is not necessarily high, it will likely increase substantially. So we may, as a bank, we may be eager to grant a loan with high LTV and relatively even high debt service to income, and it may be understandable and rational. So the macroprudential authority may decide, so perhaps we should differentiate. But when you differentiate, you really micromanage. So perhaps it's better to say part of the portfolio may not comply. Of course, you would like to see what the banks do in this part, but this is, I think, an important self-constraint. Now, there are some time before in Poland, we've been considering discussing the interaction between various aspects of financial stability, and what I thought was somehow lacking in this discussion was the consumer protection. So historically, there are mostly two pillars of financial stability: macroprudential policy and consumer protection. All are important, and now we have macroprudential policy added. Now they are all needed. If we only have macroprudential policy but fail to have either of the policies, nothing will work. If we fail to have sound macroprudential policy, whatever rules we impose on macroprudential level will not work, because if we don't have strong supervision on micro level, these rules will not be observed. They will be circumvented. We have to know that the banks really are audited and supervised in a strict way. And this is where strong institutions come. If we, on the other hand, fail to have a good consumer protection, we may end up in a situation of mis-selling. Banks offering products to clients that in a short term bring big profits to banks because they have hidden risks that materialize only further down the road. As supervisors, we may be happy because once we do not go deep enough, we will only see these profits in the financial sector, and we'll see that there are high capital buffers, the system is sound, and everything works fine. But once we have this lack of consumer protection, we will end up in a situation that people will have debt burden that is unsustainable, and it may lead to even political process that will destabilize the financial system or the economy. This is the problems faced in Hungary with foreign exchange loans. We have a similar but not such severe issue with foreign exchange loans in Poland as well, and many countries where such loans were granted. So I had a privilege of talking with head of Financial Conduct Authority in UK, which is essentially responsible for this consumer protection, but also for competition in UK among institutions. So he says that he has a different perspective towards some issues than macroprudential side, but because for him, the failure of some institutions is not such a bad thing, because it's like a survival of the fittest. If some institutions fail to provide products that are good and clients want them and fail to be competitive enough, he should go out from the market. So it's about innovation, providing good products to the economy, but at the same time, seeing that consumers are offered products that they need. So I was surprised how deep they go. They even have collaboration with media companies, and they look for, they have information of marketing campaigns in social media and on internet, how to which groups products are sold. Which products are sold to which groups, who is targeted, and whether the risks are well suited. Because if we say risky products to elderly people, well, this is a way to make quick profit, but it's not good in the long run. I'm not saying that I would not do that if I were in the shoes of the banker. It's like we only know ourselves to the extent we have been tested, and it's all about incentives. So when our salary depends on selling these products, and we would likely to do so. So it's all about setting incentives right, and perhaps Financial Conduct Authority is the institution that would say this is not allowed and this is allowed. And actually they have very strong power. They can completely disallow sale of certain products, which is like killing line of business. So the power is relatively strong. Also with power comes responsibility. So, and this is accountability that is important. Once we have independence, which is crucial for good decision-making process, we should also be accountable for what we do, and therefore transparent. Once we are transparent in our decision-making process, it imposes a constraint on us that we would need to reveal what we thought and how we analyzed. And this creates incentive to have a good analytical process behind. If we lack transparency, we can do whatever we want, and there is only God and history that will judge us. And it's better that our fellow citizens can judge us as well. Now, without macroprudential policy, we may sometimes fail, on the other hand, that even the soundness of individual institutions and on consumers does not entail the soundness of the whole system, because if the soundness on micro level may not translate on the stability of the whole system, because each institution will be analyzed separately and will fail to account how systemic the risk may become. Even when we look, it may be types of loans granted, that we will see the concentration in the whole economy of certain loans that exposes the economy to systemic risk in certain area. And this is where the central bank has a competitive edge, because it's used to macro analysis rather than to micro analysis. So the two can work together well. Central bank providing, or the macro side providing analytical and quantitative tools, and micro side providing on-site view and more real and real-life perspective. Now, sharing some remarks on Polish experience. How we stand with time?
25 minutes.
Okay. So, here is a complicated table, which I initially devised. Is it important? Well, it turns out it's not that important. What we have in the first column are potential sources of systemic risk. Market failures, or these limited cognitive limitations, that we do not really see what are the consequences of what we do, because the system is so complex, and it may end up in a systemic crisis. There are dimensions of it, cyclical, that we have phases of the cycle where there is boom and bust, or structural, that we have some more deep-rooted characteristic of the system that is invariant across time. Now, European Systemic Risk Board has devised a number of intermediate objectives that should help institutions to focus on particular types of risks. So either the risk related to growth or size of debt and leverage, maturity mismatch and liquidity risk in the banking sector, concentration of exposures, misaligned incentives that I mentioned, or simply a resilience of the financial infrastructure. My experience is that we tend to focus a lot on the first, so cyclical component, that is natural for a central bank, and it's much more difficult to understand well the other components. We will see how detrimental this approach is, but it's way more difficult, I think, to have a sound analysis of structural risk. It requires a very relatively complex models that have financial system and all the interrelations inside. And they are not yet there, or not the ones that we would like to have. So I recall our previous meetings, and there is a question to what extent we should be attached to categorizations here. Well, I'm no longer very much attached to any categorization here. It's basically about thinking what is the systemic risk stemming from, and what are the tools that we would likely use. Some tools are imposed and there is a closed list and that's it, and sometimes it's more flexible. In terms of concentration of exposures, there is large exposures limit that I mentioned. It is a purely macroprudential tool for single institution. However, my friend at ECB has done research using real data on exposures of European banks and various companies, and he has shown that in such a network analysis, relatively complex, these limit of exposures act as a backstop on contagion effects. And if we set limits slightly lower, there is no contagion or very limited contagion across the banking sector. And when they are higher, there is contagion, which is clearly a macro-prudential perspective rather than microprudential perspective. Now, choice of instruments should be adequate, effective, efficient, proportional. Well, sounds nice, but it all boils down in the end to how good the analysis is, how well reflects the problem at hand. So even when we would say what we would like to do, in the end, the crucial aspect is what tools we have at our disposal, analytical tools to analyze the problem, if it's adequate. So whether it will target the systemic risk exclusively and correctly, effective, what will be the results of the use. And this is about calibration. So we would need a model that would evaluate what are the responses of the system to various calibrations. And so when we want to have all the list fulfilled, it's all about the quality of the analytical framework that allows us to answer these questions. What we use in Poland, well, it's a learning process. Part is obviously a qualitative analysis, so it's pros and cons of different instruments from economic and legal perspectives. Sometimes legally something is not, even economically it might be reasonable, but it's not feasible legally. That's it. We need to understand at theoretical level the transmission mechanism. Why it's so important? Because no model will account for all transmission mechanisms. So we need to know what parts are missing in the model, and at this on expert level evaluate what are the problems related to failing to account for some aspects. And we all know it, that it's always good to say, well, this is in line with international experience. That usually, if we have no analysis, doing things in line with international experience is not the first best, but it's a start. But we should be careful with doing it routinely, because each economy is different, and there is a question to what extent the average is right under these circumstances and for our economy. So moving to quantitative analysis, and the last point on data, cross-country data and Polish data that we use. So once there is, given that there is limited historical history of financial cycles and crises in individual countries, apart from US and perhaps some European, we turn to cross-country experience, to do analysis on panel data, to see patterns that work for individual countries. But we should be careful in trying to put into the models as many country characteristics as possible to account for these idiosyncratic aspects. Level of debt, not only the dynamics of debt, but level of debt, strength of institutions, type of loans available. Because only then, by accounting for the differences, we could say that indeed we fine-tune the instruments to our economy. It's a process. So in terms of models we use, well, we do not have a general equilibrium model that would account for all interactions and all feedback loops. Well, actually there are GSG models, but they are not very much used because of their limitations. So even though from theoretical perspective they can provide a holistic answer, so what is the final outcome of these particular instruments on the whole economy, including all the feedback loops, it is under the assumptions of what the model includes and what it includes not. And given that solving the models is very difficult under realistic assumptions, we need to simplify assumptions. And the most important simplifications are the fundamental ones regarding expectations, which are assumed to be in line with rational expectation hypothesis, so that all people think the same, and this is in line with the structure of the model, which greatly facilitates the solution of the model, and it's only made because of this, not because economists really believe that people are identical in this dimension, but because it's very difficult to come up with a different model. The solutions now increasingly available are agent-based models, but they are only in nascent stage. So what we do is mostly use satellite models, so going issue by issue, and we have partial equilibrium answers that I will show you. And I think this is not fully satisfactory. The fully satisfactory will be a holistic answer, but this is to some extent to take a perspective using microdata from households, take a macro perspective and try to see whether the two come together and provide a similar answer. If they do, we may perhaps can have more confidence in the result. But we should be aware that we do not account for full result. So, examples. I will provide 2 or 3. Calibration of debt service to income. So, debt service to income is one of the most commonly used tools worldwide, primarily in developing economies, but increasingly so in developed economies. ESRB has a list on collateral stretch, borrower stretch, and banking stretch. Banking is about capital, collateral stretch is mostly about LTV, and borrower stretch is mostly about debt servicing costs. And debt to income or debt service to income is one of the tools that is contemplated. There are many articles and there is research that shows that imposing these limits on debt service to income, like 40 or 50% of that debt servicing costs cannot surpass 40 or 50% of household disposable income, have an impact on credit dynamics. So they impact credit. But my question is it really a sign of success? Because if our aim is to limit credit dynamics, there are far better tools to do it. Just impose limit on credit expansion, and you have it right away if this is your target. So it shows us that the target is not really to limit the expansion of credit, but to affect the riskiness of this expansion. So we want to eliminate the households that will have big problems with servicing the debt without necessarily eliminating the household that should be granted the debt. There is, so far, we have not encountered any ways of accounting for these negative side effects, so for how costly it is, by how often we eliminate those that should not be eliminated. So we have devised a relatively simple framework, and this was surprising because when we devised this idea how to work it out, it was relatively simple. There is no fancy econometrics around it. But we looked, someone has done it because it's so straightforward. No one has done it. I've been to some conferences, no one had pointed out that they've seen it, something like this. So it's simple, but I think it's relatively, it provides a good, provides decision maker with more information of what are the consequences of his action. So what's the general idea? Well, we need to know who is overly indebted. Some of the measures of over-indebtedness are related particularly to debt service to income, but we should not explain with the over-indebtedness with the variable that we want to use. So we use two complementary variables based on micro-survey we do in Poland on households, which is a twin survey for household finance and consumption network done at European level. And I think what crisis has taught us is that we need to have, it's not only about the average, or perhaps it's not about the average that we see, but the distribution in the system. So it's not, those aspects are important. So the granular data are needed for sound decision making. We do it in complementary way. So we do a micro simulation model. So we simulate each household income of a household with stress tests, accounting for how probable it is to lose a job based on labor survey, what are the income sources, what is the type of debt, and how sensitive it will be, given its characteristics, to shocks in interest rate and foreign exchange. And then we see how the income buffer will change. And once it becomes negative, we see, well, under stress scenario, we say that households is likely to be overly indebted. As a complementary way, we ask households whether they feel overly indebted. And I think it's important to have this robustness check, because once we have, let's say, an objective model, which may not be true, but also we do not ask households, but we also have a question answer from households, this is important. First, we know that the results are perhaps more robust, and once we want to explain our actions to the public, we will likely be more in line with the public perception of what is right and wrong. So it will be easier to implement and more robust in economic or econometric terms. So it's a simple logic model when we have 0 or 1, over-indebted or not, and we want to see whether debt service to income is a good explanatory variable. Well, it ends up that, yes, the area under the receiver operated curve, so roughly speaking, the probability of correctly labeling households as over-indebted or not is 70%, 70-something percent. Not bad, but as a single variable, it's not, we see that its discriminatory power is not that huge. In the framework, what is easy in logic in such models is that we can account for important failures that each non-perfect model has. So look at what is the actual state and in columns and model result. If the actual state is 1, so someone is over-indebted, and the model shows, yes, he's over-indebted, we have true positive, fine. But we can have a false positive. The model can claim that someone is over-indebted, whereas in reality, he is not, or she is not. And this is type 1 error. And there is type 2 error when actually someone is over-indebted, but model fails to account for it. When you want to eliminate false negative, you just put debt service to income at 0. So you say everyone is over-indebted. Sure. So you will not miss anyone who is really over-indebted. But you will commit many type 1 errors. So you will eliminate many people who are not really over-indebted. Then the framework allows you to weight these errors. So this is this fee, the weight of each error. It can be 50-50. It's a default assumption. But I believe it should not be 50-50. The type 1 error should have higher priority. Why? Because once you set debt service to income at 30%, for example, or 40%, and you eliminate, and households above cannot get credit, and some of them should get credit, it's a final decision. They are shut from the credit market. But if you let someone pass this test, the bank still, so type 1 error is final. But if households, the debt service to income, fails to account for real credit risk, and therefore bank can consider granting a loan, the bank still has an obligation to do credit assessment and may eventually decide that the household is too risky. So there is a second backstop on type 2 error. Therefore, I believe that the weight of type 2 errors should be higher, and this is in the table to the right. In the rows of the table, there are various shocks that we consider in income buffer model, so there is this objective model, and in self-assessment. And this is the optimal debt service to income in bold numbers that we get depending on what is the weight of each error. Once it's 50-50, based on the micro survey we have done, that was in 2014, now we have a fresh data, better, that we have changed the question so that it will better answer the question that we ask here, and I look forward to doing the analysis that will likely start already now in December, because we have just finished the report on the survey. It tells us that it's around between 35 and 40%. That should be the limit, if this is 50-50. But observe what happens if we believe that one type of errors should have a higher weight. Well, if it's increasingly more costly, the divergence of optimal levels increases substantially to 40 or even 60%. What it shows, first, that we do not have really a robust result, or the decision maker knows that there is high uncertainty concerning the repercussions of his decision. And importantly, sorry for this is in Polish, I missed that. In self-assessment, this is brak meaning no limit. So the optimal should be no limit at all, because it's too costly. This is a first result. We'll look into the data once again, but the basic framework stays, and it can be used in any country that has access to relatively detailed database on individual households. And importantly, it accounts for these two sides of decision-making in macroprudential policy. The effectiveness, how often we target the right households, and what are the costs imposed on households that should not be eliminated. So I think then decision-making understand the consequences of his actions more fully. Now, on the cyclical risk and the counter-cyclical capital buffer, acknowledging the limitations of time, I will point out to key aspects of our thinking. So the Basel recommendations suggest, well, there is observation following the crisis that there is some procyclicality in the assessment of risk. So the top chart is a graphical representation of this phenomena when we would likely have a perception of relatively low risk that contributes to expansion in credit. This is what we have seen prior to the crisis during Great Moderation. The Great Moderation by itself, by definition, when we say that there is a decreased probability of economic recession because there is more stable growth that we have observed in US and in other economies as well, and this is what central banks have been saying, that we have better understanding and better management of the economy. That essentially implies that there can be more loans granted, because it means that the probability that people will, on a systemic scale, have problems with debt servicing due to unemployment is lowered, because the risk of unemployment on systemic scale is lower. So this perception of lower risk contributed to credit expansion. Now the idea of countercyclical buffer is that once we have a credit expansion, but the problem is that once we have a flat standard binding standard on capital requirement, and we have a recession and losses on banks, this level can become binding. And banks can do two things: either increase capital in order to comply with requirement, but this can be costly and very difficult in crisis situation. Or, in order to comply, shrink the balance sheets. But if it shrinks the balance sheet, it means that it will grant less loans, which will contribute to the recession, and we will have so-called credit crunch. The idea behind countercyclical buffer is that we increase bank capital in boom phase and eliminate it, so allow to use it, this buffer, in the recession phase. And there is therefore we decrease the risk of credit crunch. We may not necessarily like to target specifically level of credit action, but we simply decrease the risk of negative spiral between binding capital requirements and bank behavior. Now, the Basel and also European regulations suggest to look at credit gap, so deviation of credit gap from trend, which is a level of credit to GDP, deviation from long-term trend. However, already in monetary policy, we understand relatively well that using a single indicator for decision-making process is not necessarily the right decision. We would like to have more informed decision, and how much we can gain from other indicators. What we use, and these are essentially the slides that we provide to the Financial Stability Committee in Poland. We look at financial cycle, whether it's recovery or expansionary phase. So this is when our last governor asked, first and foremost, I want to know in which part of cycle we are. So there was analytical work for identifying the phase of the cycle. And there have been some tools developed in National Bank of Poland to do precisely so. And the initial work suggests that the length of the cycle is around 10 years. However, it may vary because these are structural features. So this is one. Second, we obviously look at the credit gap as a guideline, but this is a single indicator that fails to account for many characteristics. So we have also built an early warning model based on international experience. So we looked at what types of variables have been useful in predicting crisis historically and how well they work. We use it in sample, out of sample, and we have such an early warning model that I will not spend too much time on, or no time, at saying what it implies. I will only show how we use it. So on the left-hand side, we have models in the probability of crisis in Poland in between 1 and 4 years in advance, stemming from models use both domestic and international variables. The prime international variables is VIX, the so-called fear index, which shows the price of risk in the US stock market, but it's a good proxy of price of risk in international markets as well. And surprisingly, we have found in our research that low levels of VIX have contributed to increased probability of crisis down the road. So this was in line with Minsky hypothesis. We have also seen that the single credit gap has good explanatory power, but we have substantially increased it by using additional variables. So just coming back to the previous slide, when we would have three variables model, the probability of correctly grouping non-crisis and crisis situations is above 90%. Using a single variable is around 70% only. So this, it's no surprise. It's to some extent natural. The question we had, initially we used the best model or best 2 or 3 models, but then we thought how we want to use it more comprehensively. And then the chart that you see, the black line is the average weighted by the performance of the model, and the bands are the bands for the lowest and highest probabilities among the models, around 200 of them. So that we do not want to discard the information that may come from some models, and we see that on average there is nothing, but some models that historically perform not that well, but perhaps they tell us something, and this is a point in time when we should ask ourselves, so let's dig in more deeply and understand what are the risks these models pick up. Then we can do more detailed analysis in this area. If this is debt servicing cost or something in the real estate market that really beefs up the results in these models. On the right-hand side, we only use domestic variables so that to see to what extent this stems from international developments or to what extent it stems purely from domestic ones. Now, we have been asked to evaluate the impact on LTV limits on credit. And I only would like to point out the way we approached it. I was quite glad how my team coped with it, because we have been asked to do it, and we decided that we go along 3 lines to have a more robust answer. But these are rather preliminary because it took us only 1 month, so that was really a fast-track work. But the way we did it is to use, on one hand side, a macro model to see, looking at aggregate variables, learning the model, teaching the model what was the response in the credit to initial implementation of LTV standards and what, by extrapolation, it would mean in future as the limits will be increasingly binding, because in Poland the limits initially in 2014 was 95, and that was pre-announced that they will be increasingly lowered from 95 initially to 90, 85 and 80 already now. So we were asked somewhere in 2015 what would be the final outcome of these. So we taught a model on Polish data, what was the outcome of initial margins and what would be, and then there was some calibration depending on how severe because it's not necessarily linear, going down from 90 to 80 is not the same. Then we used a micro model for banks in a panel setting, so we could account for how each bank behaved following the implementation of these rules. And we also looked at this household survey, so we could see how many households have asked for credit with what LTV and how many households will fail to have financial resources to ask for credit with given limits. And therefore we could see what is the current impact and what is the expected impact in 3 approaches, how different they are, and regardless of what is the outcome, I think the process is important, that we try to provide answer using various perspectives that are complementary, that use different assumptions, and therefore if they coincide in results, it can increase our confidence in analysis and the implications. If they do not, well, we should be more cautious. But if you use only single approach, we have the model risk that we do not necessarily fully understand. Now, last but not least, particularly at NBU, monetary and macroprudential policy cohabitation. So there is the table above. It's relatively well known. In rows, we have business cycle in the expansionary or contractory phase, and financial cycle expansion, crisis or contraction. Or crisis seems something different. So occasionally, we will have conflict of interest. There will be expansion of business cycle, but financial cycle will be contracting. Why we will observe differences in phases? Because research tells us that credit cycle is way longer than business cycle. Business cycle is 4-5 years. Credit cycle is 10 years or longer. Therefore, the phases from time to time will not coincide. And there would be a tension that one policy would like to do one thing and the other one would like to do the other thing. It's not necessarily, the question is how often they will arise. For Poland, we see that based on our initial analysis, that would not arise very often, like 15% of time. And it is observed in many countries that they keep interest rates low because the overall economy is not in very good shape, but low interest rate environment contributes to perhaps pockets of risk arising here and there. And macroprudential policy can act as a targeted tool towards this risk. So it's not necessarily inconsistent to be doing different things. However, there is a potential risk, because once you have this credit, having everything under one roof increases the effectiveness of information sharing, of how the macroprudential policy alters the monetary policy transmission mechanism. It's good. But at the same time, like in Bank of England, I will see how it ends up, is that you have, sometimes the conflict will be strong, like you have high inflation, but increasing interest rates may be detrimental to financial stability. Or vice versa. The problem is that inflation is observable and violations of the target are clear for the public. With systemic risk, they are clear only with the benefit of hindsight, because we do not observe systemic risk. We cannot measure it. It's not observable. We may try to measure it, but it's not observable. So the question is, what will have an upper hand? And in the end, it may be that it's inflation, because it's observable, and we may not necessarily understand fully what are the consequences for financial stability, and we may not be able to fully communicate it to decision makers. However, the additional problem and challenge is that, as I discussed at the beginning, we should expect that there will be a crisis on the record of macroprudential authority. And once it's also under the roof of monetary policy, it may negatively affect the credibility of monetary policy, because the authority itself was not credible. This is a challenge that we should perhaps address already in advance and communicate what we may try to achieve and what we should achieve not, and not create expectation that there would be no crisis at all, because there would be. And if we promise that we would avoid all crises, and we fail to live to this promise, this will affect our credibility. This is something to ponder before. So, concluding, be humble but bold, so recognizing our limitations. When I talk with my friends from banks, central banks may sometimes have a tendency to say the banks do not know what they are doing. Well, I believe that they know. It's simply that the incentive structure is different. So we should not think that we are definitely better than them. Sometimes we may see things better, but we should also recognize that we fail to see many, many things. So I think it's crucial that we have good analytical tools. Once we provide decision makers with clear analysis, sound analysis, and they see and they can recognize the quality of analysis, even if they take different decisions, it will sink into their thinking and it will likely affect positively the quality of decision-making process. So we should always strive to do our best. This is the least what we should do. And we should also think about crisis management in terms of communication, because sooner or later there would be a crisis. And avoiding it at all costs can be too costly, that we should not allow any banks to fail, because, well, that we will be to blame. It's difficult. I am lucky not in a position to take these decisions, but I think we should think in advance of how we would do it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Piotr, it was an excellent presentation, a very comprehensive introduction to macroprudential policies and tools and interaction with monetary policy. Thank you a lot for that. We have roughly 20 minutes for Q&As and probably 4 to 5 questions. And I have the first one. I want to get back to the trade-off between economic growth and financial stability. And Ukraine has gone through a major crisis, unprecedented crisis during 2014-16. And our response was to make banking regulations much tougher. So we introduced very strict requirements with regards to how banks have to assess their borrowers, requirements to capital and liquidity, and so we are always asking ourselves whether we are too tough or we are not tough. We understand that we may end up with a perfectly sound financial sector that is not lending to businesses. But if we make a one step up, if we look at global regulations, Basel and Global Financial Stability Board decisions, do you think they offer the right balance between incentives and prescriptions to banks? Because there is an ongoing discussion whether global regulations should be changed, amended. What's your opinion? Is the balance right?
Not easy question, definitely. I think that it's the right direction, though we should acknowledge that though these rules mostly are suited for big international banks, and they to some extent target the issue of interconnectedness of these banks, which is not that important for domestic banks in many countries like ours. So I focus on lending standards on domestic level is potentially the most important aspect, because the non-banking sector and the interconnected and the shadow banking sector in developing economies are not that important as in other sectors. It's important that, secondly, the internal models they use that allow sometimes to game the capital are not common in developing economies. They will only become. So this is not such a big problem. I think you are not alone in imposing stricter standards on lending following the crisis. Many countries have done so. Ireland did, just following the crisis in many areas. Hungary as well. And I think it's important to recognize that macroprudential policy setting a right incentive structure that is invariant across the cycle is a good way to do things. So we should not think that there is a slowdown in economy now, so let's relax standards by allowing to build a bubble. This is just postponing the problem. So I think if we can devise a standards that we think should be binding across the cycle, regardless of economic conditions, that's a good way forward.
Thank you. Questions, please.
Thank you for presenting your overall results of your scientific the logic models. You have used logic models, I understand. And my question was, will consider the next issue, which set of variables have demonstrated the most statistical power to withstand the future crisis for Poland and other Eastern European countries, which are very transited to post-push shock for foreign exchange, market shocks, and others.
For those who did not hear the question is about explanatory variables that have the best predictive power to forecast crisis.
This is something I have not discussed, but this is in the slide. It's also available in the description, in the working paper that I have sent as link to which I have sent. We are still working on the model, so we are constantly testing because research never ends. So we are satisfied. Then, as we are satisfied, we move to other areas where we are unsatisfied, and then we come back to the areas to improve once again. So the variables were VIX, as I mentioned, debt service ratio that is available on BIS site. Actually, that was a great experience with, I don't know whether you know Matthias Drechman, who is working at BIS. He was doing research on this, and he developed database on this. And I learned from ESRB that they approached him to share this data set. And I mailed him if he could share the data set with us, because we are doing similar research. And on the next day, I had the whole database on my email. So I really thank him for being so open. So debt service ratio is another variable. Price to income, a relation of prices to income on real estate market. So price developments on real estate. Value added of the financial sector in the value added. Once it increases, it's in line with hypothesis put forward by Andrew Haldane. It's given that the value added measures basically the profits of the sector, either shared among employees, distributed to shareholders, or paid as taxes. It seemed that that substantial increases in value added contributed to systemic risk. So this was rather systemic risk that the banks were taking. But we also looked at, now we want to account for more structural aspects of economies, accounting for level of debt, because there is research clearly pointing out to the fact that level of debt is important for the probability of crisis. So it's an ongoing research, but most of the variables that we have used and perhaps new that we'll already use but have not yet published will be available there soon.
In the beginning, with the trend of the excess growth, and other line is the more moderate growth under the more strict financial stability. In the beginning, first, yes.
This one?
From this graph, it's not clear what strategy is, Mr. Overshuk asked, what strategy is better. Problem is, I think that it's comment, it's not question. Problem is, in case if we consider this graph, maybe it's better to choose more excessive growth, because finally we will have more accumulative growth than in case if the more strict financial stability. But problem this ex ante is difficult to assess the deepest of the crisis. This means the answer that why a lot of people in the bank in Poland around the world started to work with the financial stability, because it's unpredictability of this cycle of the crisis is very difficult to assess, and of course asymmetric risk of the more deepest crisis could be. And second is a very nice graph about in the end is the financial crisis prediction, not prediction, but is a probability of financial crisis. Question is, are you publish these graphs in the future. And in
They are on the website.
yeah, but in case is what your assessment, because you generate like some negative expectation about the crisis, some, how to say, pro and cons. Of course, transparency is good, but from other side, if your assessment for future will be high probability in the 3 years later, it's maybe some problem for, how to say, semi-generation of the risk. What do you think?
I think it's important how we indeed communicate the limitations of the model. So we do not say that this is the reality, this is what the model suggests, therefore we take action. This is a justification for the action. There's a question to which you might think that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, that people, oh, there is a probability of crisis. But once they think that there is increased probability of crisis, they would perhaps restrain the actions, therefore avoid the crisis altogether. So the problem might be that there will be no crisis, and we have said that there will be. So it creates a problem of how we would act. In the end, it's always easier to act aggressively because if you act aggressively and there will be no crisis, it's because you act aggressively. And if you can always explain it this way. And if you fail to act and there will be a crisis, you are easier to blame. So this creates an incentive to act, but there is disincentive because you do not really know everything, and you may be afraid that you will translate your actions into this lower growth. I think that in the end, I would be more afraid of limiting growth. And from my perspective, it's targeting risk when we have it clearly identified. And when we do not, be relatively constrained in terms of aggressiveness, because we don't know to what extent we will be really killing the growth potential.
What any model cannot to provide you, how to say, high probability of the avoiding of risk. It's every time it's very big unpredictability. This is maybe hard to see what is better, to keep strong or.
Well, with counter-cyclical capital buffer, there is the benefit is that the research shows that when we ask banks to gather more capital in boom phase, it has negligible impact on the credit expansion, and so negative consequences are very limited. Once you do it, ask banks to gather more capital in recession, it has very strong negative impact. So we can say that we are building buffers that are not very costly with counter-cyclical capital buffer. Which is very convenient. I think it's more difficult to answer this question in the same way with borrower-based measures like debt service to income, or because they cut some people from the market. And I know some decision makers who are reluctant to go so aggressively in this area. However, I know some who think that this is something we should do. I only point out to the question marks there are regarding the consequences of our action. That if we act, we do not understand which line is the real one because of our actions. But we should be aware that the more we act and the less we understand, the more likely is the dashed line. And that dashed line is still positive because there is decreased probability of crisis, but perhaps we act in the wrong way, we don't really decrease the probability of crisis and even stifle growth. This is the recurring critique from academic community, that macroprudential policy focuses too much on benefits and too little on costs. And I read this article by Daron Acemoglu twice, and and it sank deeply. And I really think it provides a great food for thought in terms of costs and benefits, even when we cannot really calculate what they are. But then once we understand that there are potential costs, if we would constrain ourselves to clear situations, negative externalities, high systemic risk that is clearly identified, we decrease the probability that we would act too aggressively, stifling financial sector. So it's not that we will identify which line we are in, but it's, let's say, changing the probability without knowing what the probability is of one and the other scenario.
Who has the closing question? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for presentation. And, sorry, my question is that do you have some operational researches? I mean, this type of research requires like a year or half a year to look at through the data, etc. But for operational activities like month-to-month decisions, what kind of early warning indicators do you use, or do you have some kind of automated dashboard where you can look at set of indicators?
Well, we have both. Actually, this was developed by my team for decision-making process, so we use it routinely for decision-making process. We knew in advance, so we were lucky that we were established before there was macroprudential policy, so we knew what was first in the pipeline. So we started with counter-cyclical buffer because we knew that it was the first tool that we would have to operationalize. So we devised early warning models, and there was work in my division and the other division, that is strictly a research division, on financial cycle in Poland. So in my division, we try to do things together. So we both do research that is operational. Of course, it takes time, and but it also keeps people motivated. That they know what's the decision-making process, and they know what they can add. At the same time, it's important to work with people who have a very strong quantitative background that will put a quality check on what is being done, and will not be constrained by time to the extent we may be, and they will dig more deeply into certain areas. We also have dashboards, and heat maps, and I think they are important both for communication internally and as ways to highlight areas we should simply look more deeply. I won't mention which movie it was, but I sympathize with the perception that we have rough indicators that usually work. When they flag something red, let's go more deeply into it, and let's have a part of people that would be contrarian, a small group that might look into other areas that are not flagged, so because some models are missing something. But we should have definitely guidelines, and analytical and quantitative ones that would synthesize the data for us. Because in the world where we have so much data, we should use tools to synthesize information from this data. Understanding the limitations the models have, but simply synthesize information for us and for the decision makers. So we constantly do this research in my team. We now develop a model for answering the question of what is the optimal level of capital in the banking sector from macroprudential perspective. We still recalibrated the debt service to income model with the new data set, and we want to answer the question how micromanageable we should be on this front. There is research on riskiness of loan portfolio in corporate sector that some people do, and all these information from satellites models creates a more comprehensive assessment. But what I realized recently is that once you have a quantitative analysis, it provides you with clearer guidance rather than quantitative one. Because with quantitative analysis, you just flag risk and mitigating factors. And you don't really know how to weight them. It's then the expert judgment. But if you can beef up the expert judgment with saying that historically that was as an important factor, and we see it. Of course, we know that history may not repeat itself, but if we say that, then what is our expert judgment based on? It's really on historical developments. We can think how historical developments may change those structural features, but everything in the end can be fed into some structural thinking. It's more difficult, and it's important to have this expert judgment at the end. But I see how the decision-making process has been changed due to increasingly stronger backing from the quantitative analysis.
Dear colleagues, I guess we have run out of time and we have to wrap up. I want to thank Piotr one more time. It was probably one of the most condensed and comprehensive lectures I ever had in my life. Thank you for that. So, and you're welcome to the National Bank of Ukraine. Probably we'll have pleasure to see you here next year.
I think it's even it's in the schedule. But
it's in the schedule. Okay, so we got your promise. So thank you very much.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. Sharing experience is a great privilege. And I really look forward to meeting you again in future soon. Thank you.